Game. Ooh, the broadcast is live. Okay.
Okay. Hey, everyone. It's awesome hosting this broadcast. What is this called? Webcast? Podcast? Clearly not just podcast, because we are seeing the mugs of two people right here. So my name is Anand Chigran. I'm the CEO for a relatively young company called StepZen. And our job is to enable front-end developers to build awesome web experiences and websites leveraging the data from the backend. Okay? And how easy can backend access be is what StepZen is committed to do. It's absolute pleasure to talk to Randall. I've known Randall for now about a year. I wish I'd known him for a decade. I think he would have been as much fun before. So before we get started, Randall, tell us a bit about yourself in your own words.
All right. Well, what's up to all of the audience chiming in or tuning in from all over the place? Also, Anthony said woot from YouTube. So Anthony, woot right back, man. We're excited to have you here. But yeah, I'm Randall. I run developer advocacy at a little company called Okta. My background is I've been writing code like forever. I absolutely love it. It is the most fun shit in the whole world. And today, I mainly try to make Okta's developer products, more popular in the dev community. So I do a lot of public speaking, a lot of writing, a lot of building applications and open source projects, particularly around the web security space. That's sort of like a lot of my background and expertise. And yeah, I just love developer services. So I'm more than happy to talk about whatever you want.
Okay, awesome. Fantastic. Randall is, of course, extremely humble. Just before this cast, he said, "Hey, Anand, let's not talk about him, but how can we get his experiences and his perspective without talking about him?" In fact, I'm going to embarrass him even more a bit later on. So then he's going to turn red, I'm sure. But before we get started, just kind of a very, very simple general question, Randall. As you all can see, I have been on this earth and kind of doing developer work and engineering work for a long, long time. And the world has really changed. I feel that the world has really changed. And just want to kind of get a perspective from you, Randall. You have been on this journey for about 2 decades, but you have seen people who have come before you, and you have seen lots of people who have come after you. What's really changing out
there? Well, just in general, I got started programming a little over 20 years ago or so when I was pretty young. And at the time when I got started programming, I actually did a lot of like scheme programming. Ironically, like, you don't hear that many people say like, yeah, scheme is my first programming language or whatever. Yes. And then I get into like a lot of lower level stuff like C and even some like assembler, GNU, AT&T syntax for the win. But anyways, yeah, it's definitely changed a lot. When I started working professionally, like a lot of the modern web frameworks were just starting to get rolled out, like Django, Rails, things like that. And so that really dramatically changed the type of development that like most of us in the professional world were doing at the time. And today, just in the last 5-6 years, it's changed dramatically even more. Like there's tons of people building substantially complex, like real applications on the front end, particularly using JavaScript, which is absolutely bananas to me. Like if I would have told myself 10 years ago that like today, most web applications are going to be built on the client using JavaScript, the 10-year-old Randall would have just laughed in my face and said, "You're absolutely crazy. No one's going to be writing JavaScript in 10 years. Like it's going to be gone, eradicated from the internet." So it has been a bit of a whirlwind, I will for sure say.
No, that's actually an awesome point. We'll get to JavaScript and its derivatives like React and others in a few minutes. But I also have kind of a personal observation, and it's very interesting. I think that the art of development has gotten a lot more democratized, and it's got a lot more democratized because of the availability of tools and toolings that allow people to kind of learn. Because there's no shortage of really smart people outside kind of the hallowed worlds of computer science right? There was no shortage of really smart people. But I think there was some barrier between kind of being able to learn the art of developing and programming when you were sitting in some other things. And I've just been absolutely thrilled to see the kinds of people who are entering into this world that every day I learn from them. But if you say that did they professionally get a computer science degree or anything else like that, the answer is no, right? And I think to me that's perhaps the most astounding development that's happened in this world, in the world of at least in the world of development and programming.
It's true. As actually, I'm going to plug all the smart people watching this stream right now. Also, hello, Lucia. I see you commenting on there. But yeah, like one of the coolest things about programming is, and it's always been this way, like forever, right? But like you can just learn this shit. And it's so cool. Like you can literally sit down in front of a keyboard and just start typing some stuff. And you can type enough things. And then you can like click a button to run that thing and do something that like no one has ever seen before.
Yes.
And that is one of the coolest things in the world. You don't have to have like a PhD in mathematics to do it. You don't need to be like, you know, in school for 20 years or whatever. You can do that at 5 years old, 10 years old, you know, like you need a basic understanding of principles. But you can figure things out. Myself, actually, like I'm mostly self-taught. Like I got started as a kid, and one of the best things I ever did, and this is really going to explain how dated I am nowadays, but like when I got started programming, I got into it because I really wanted to like hack some MS-DOS games. And I'd heard at the time that like MS-DOS games were like, you know, amazing. And my family growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, but someone in the church that we went to growing up donated to my family this really old MS-DOS computer. And there was only one thing installed on the computer. It was the Wolfenstein 3D game. And that game, by the way, is my all-time favorite game. It is still holds up. It's absolutely amazing. It's super cool. Like John Carmack and John Romero are my personal idols in the programming space for building this cool shit. But anyways, I got into programming because I thought, okay, I can like do some cool hacks in Wolfenstein. And I heard that you could do that if you knew how to program. So I literally went to the library. I got the first book I saw in programming, which is just so happened to be on scheme programming because I had no idea what was going on. And I just started reading it. And, you know, within a certain amount of time, I was able to figure out, okay, you type some code into a text file, you run the text file in a certain way and it works. And it set me off on this like lifelong adventure of like building things and working with fun people and like trying to do stuff. From there, the thing that really changed my life substantially was like, I learned, oh, if you want to get better at programming, like you need help. Like you need to ask questions sometimes they don't have in the book. So I would join like IRC chat rooms. I think one of the ones I first got involved with was like the C chat room on Freenode. And I would ask people questions. And from there, I made some friends and they basically put me in this private chat room and they said, hey, the only rules we have here are that A, to stay in this group, this private group, you have to publish an article on the things you're building once a month. And so they forced everyone in this group to publish stuff and just share it with the group. So I started like writing blogs online, explaining the types of things I was building or what some cool research I was doing was. And it really forced me to just, you know, play around with new things and treat it as like a game almost. And like, hey, like how can I do something cool that other people are also going to find cool? And I think it's the single greatest thing about the tech field and programming in general is like, it's one of the only places you can do that. Like, there's no way that I can go to like a construction job and say, hey, I really want to learn how to pilot this crane. I'm just going to hop in the crane and start moving shit around and knocking buildings. No, that's never going to happen, right? Like, that's the barrier to entry is too high, too expensive, too dangerous, too risky, whatever. But like in our field, we have that luxury. And that's one of the main reasons why I love it is like, it's just addictive.
Oh, that's awesome. No, that's awesome. But one of the things that I've observed is that in the beginning, of course, computer science and programming was fairly esoteric, and only a few people could actually do it. And then over time, it got democratized. But then over time, as it got democratized, we also saw that kind of complexity kind of crept back in, right? Because it was so easy to kind of appeal to narrower and narrower tastes, more and more tools and frameworks and others came about. And now if you kind of look at it, right? You see that there is kind of basically a flavor of the week or a flavor of the month, or there is a specific way in which there are like 14 databases to choose from, and 12 other frameworks to choose from, and you can talk in various lingos, and you can do gRPC or HTTP, etc. Right? So this kind of complexity in my mind, in some ways, is then betraying kind of the ease of getting started. And I'm just wondering, Randall, whether you see some trends that are happening that is going to tame some of this complexity, which I think is beginning to creep back into this world.
Yeah. So just to recap your question, the question is, are there some trends that are going to make it easier to handle complexity when you're building stuff today, right? Because
yes,
it is extremely complicated to build things today. I would actually break this into two parts. Like the first part is that a lot of the complexities we see today is very tightly coupled around like web development, which is what most people do, right? Building stuff for the web in particular is getting really complicated because the technology changes so frequently, you know, especially on the client. Like browsers today are like a million times faster and have a million times more capabilities and features and all that than they did like 10 years ago. It's not even comparable. It's like an entirely different universe. And just because of expectations of like what applications people see and how they interact with it, there's just way more protocols and tools and all that you need to use. Like if you want to have a really clean web experience today, like let's say you're building some product where someone logs in and you have an e-commerce store. So you're clicking on things, you're doing all this stuff. You basically have to have some sort of single page app style experience to give people a nice browsing experience. You know, like you have to have something where like you can add stuff to the cart without refreshing the page. You want it to feel like snappy and crisp and like it's not like this like, slow disjointed experience, right? And that requires a bunch of different tools. So I guess the first part of my question is like for non-web development stuff, I think it's largely, for the most part, actually stayed relatively the same level of complexity for as far back as I can remember. Like building like non-web stuff is today basically the same as it was a few years ago. Like it's actually maybe even a little easier complexity wise, like building command line apps and tools and service daemons and things like that. There's frameworks to help you with that today. It's awesome. On the website though, the biggest trend that I see is not so much reduction of complexity, but reduction in scope of what you're doing. So what I mean by that is like 10 years ago when I was building websites, if I was a developer building it, like I'd be expected to do everything. Like I'd basically be expected to like build the back end, deploy it, manage the front end. Like it was sort of an implied expectation, I think. Today, that expectation no longer exists. Like the way it works is you have front end developers building these like highly dynamic, rich, interactive experiences. And then you have people on the back end building just these API services that those developers are talking to. Maybe you have some infrastructure people that are helping deploy and manage and scale these things. It feels like the development field has gotten a lot more specialized. And as a result of that, that comes with some benefits and trade-offs and also some bad things. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question.
No, that's absolutely an awesome point. So now if I just kind of peel the onion, is that the expression, peel the onion? I don't know. I'm not a big fan of onion, but I guess you can peel the onion and get into some more details. So people have said that look, HTML was very, very simple, right? Till it was not, till all the CSS and all the stuff kind of came about. But if you go to kind of Tim Berners-Lee world of HTML, it was relatively simple. And then it became more and more complicated. And then HTML could be served really, really fast. But then as it became more and more complicated, you required server-side components. And to get kind of the same snappiness, now you require CDN in the middle for some caching and this and that, et cetera, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a trend out there, and I just kind of tell you kind of two trends that we are seeing, and just have you comment on them. The first trend really is that the world of Jamstack, which says that is it possible for us to build some web experiences where most of the time it's kind of a static build, a la old HTML days. In fact, generate HTML that can be kind of rendered but also kind of pull dynamic content via APIs, with the A being in Jamstack. So that's one trend. And then kind of a second trend which says that look, kind of the backend stuff is all kind of has its own kind of bespoke APIs and protocols and all that stuff, and can we actually abstract that away with GraphQL, where there's a layer of abstraction and you just deal with that kind of GraphQL to deal with backends, and how that GraphQL stuff gets materialized is not the domain of the front-end user, front-end developer. So I'm seeing these two trends, and I'm wondering whether they have legs, and if so, what are your views on those?
Yeah, I can talk about this as long as you want, because it is definitely something super interesting that I personally love talking about. So let's talk about Jamstack first. And when I say Jamstack, by the way, I'm not going to specifically talk about like just Jamstack, but the concept of building static sites is extremely powerful. It's like a throwback, right, to like building static sites in the 90s and early 2000s. But I think it's making a huge comeback in a big way for two reasons. One, I think personally that the concept of like building the site itself in the front end should be completely divorced from the back end. I think it makes a lot of sense because you have very different concerns in both environments. It's also extremely like tenuous, I would say, to build these big monolithic server-side applications where you have everything being processed from the back end. Like if you're building this massive backend in Django and you're rendering all the templates and you have all the stuff, it's just really hard to do a good job at that. Like it's difficult. It doesn't matter how great of a developer you are. I assure you, it is extremely complicated, especially when you're building large sites with other people. So the concept of taking just the front end and turning that into its own project and its own engineering stuff, I'm a huge fan of that. My personal site is all built on the Hugo static site generator, which is built on Go.
Yes.
Our company site at Okta is built on top of Jekyll, Ruby-based static site generator that like everyone uses. I've done a bunch of stuff in Pelican before, in Gatsby and all those tools. Like they are amazing because they let you focus on just doing this one thing and doing it really well. And like, I'm a huge fan of that. So yes, that makes building these sites better in a lot of ways because you don't have to worry about complex backend deployments. Everything is set up by default to be cached in CDNs and like distributed to edge locations, which means you're going to have better performance for users. You also have less latency in general because you're not talking to a backend all the time. To just render basic pages, and it lets you do really cool things like have a complicated cache invalidation strategy at your edge locations to like make things work really well. So I'm like a huge fan of it. The second part that you talked about though, oh, and by the way, someone's calling out Svelte on here. Like, yes, that is super cool. Played around with it for the first time recently.
I can see that Anthony is plugging his favorite tools and frameworks.
But the second part of what you're talking about is GraphQL. GraphQL is honestly super amazing. I have a ton of thoughts on this because it's extremely beneficial in a lot of different environments. But I'm going to just share my own personal experience with why I think it's so important and so cool. So a lot of my career has been focused around building developer tools. So like I'm the author of a ton of different like developer libraries for like AWS products. I built like Twilio developer libraries. I built lots of just like standalone API services and tools. Some of them are professional, like company stuff. Some of them are just for fun that do like serve billions of requests up. And I'm one of the most opinionated people in the world about like what should a good developer service look like and how should it function. One of those things that's really important to me, and you'll get my biases in a second, but like building APIs in and of itself isn't that useful. Like it's the core of what you do, but that's not the part of your product that developers interact with the most. What they interact with the most is typically your documentation and your developer libraries. So like if I'm using Twilio to send SMS messages to someone, I personally have never looked up the Twilio raw REST APIs and said, okay, I'm going to fire off this request with this header and whatever. No. I install the Python Twilio library, or I install the JavaScript Twilio library. And I read their docs to say, okay, here's how you send an SMS message. Here's how you do this. The main point being the APIs are abstracted behind the scenes, which is a good thing. Now, where does that become a problem? Well, it becomes a problem when you have APIs with lots of endpoints that are complicated. And it's super duper complicated because trying to build really good developer libraries to support all these endpoints and do tons of different things is like basically impossible. People have taken stabs at doing it in different ways over the years, like using like Swagger, which is now called like Open API, I believe, to auto generate like REST clients and things like that. Those solutions to me are terrible. Because if you ever try working with those things, they don't feel like native and intuitive to developers. They feel like awkward and clumsy, and like it's just like trying to like fit a square into like a circular hole. GraphQL totally solves that problem because it basically says, hey, instead of you doing all this crazy work, why don't you just focus on the backend side on having a sane data structure and like a nice data model? Then from there, we are going to expose all the functionality that your API has to offer via like a single query interface, just like you would with SQL. And GraphQL has really filled this void because it not only makes it easier for people to design APIs on the backend side of things, but it makes it way easier for developers using APIs to like interact with the API, because now all they need to do is learn this really simple query syntax, and they can use like any API service. They don't have to worry about special clients for every single tool they have. They don't have to have like 50 different developer libraries installed on every project they work on. No. They just install like the query clients and they're good to go. And I'm a huge fan of that because it simplifies things for backend and front end developers. And like, I'm all about that. So huge fan.
No, and that's so. When we started the Steps journey, Randall, we of course were playing around with GraphQL, but at Apigee we were kind of REST pickets, okay? Because all our customers were doing REST, and obviously in some ways you can do anything with anything, right? But as you know, I had a background of kind of databases in the past, and in the world of databases, SQL is, whether you love it or hate it, is a fantastic abstraction between kind of physical implementations and what the users would want. And in GraphQL, I found this kind of mashing of a query language with kind of REST kind of properties to be almost perfect, that allow for the abstractions and yet allow for the flexibility for the front-end developer to actually go and ask, right? And that to me, in my age, I rarely get fascinated by phenomenally new stuff because in some ways I've seen it before. But when I saw GraphQL, I said, oh my God, this is absolutely awesome. And just to kind of tell you a bit more, what we realized is that there is a very interesting marriage in kind of the Jamstack world and the GraphQL world, which I just I'll give you my perspective and then kind of get your point of view. So static stuff is all great, but in the end, supposing you got to kind of do some personalized greeting, or if you want to kind of modify based on the weather, or you want to look up the latest inventory, or you want to do anything else, you cannot just have static sites going out there. You still need to kind of add some APIs and API constructs within your kind of Jamstack client-side, browser-side code. And the key question really then becomes, what is that API and how do you kind of protect that API and how do you kind of ensure that browsers can call it? And that's where, again, in my mind, GraphQL actually shines phenomenally, because it kind of abstracts a lot of 5, 10, 15, 20 backends behind one API. And now you're just reduced to the problem of that one API and what the right sets of things that you do out there. So I think there's a very interesting play in kind of the Jamstack world. And if you kind of believe that Jamstack still needs some dynamicism that gets delivered by APIs, that GraphQL may be the right construct for those sets of APIs.
Yeah, I mean, okay, audience poll real quick. So if you're watching this live, please type a comment in if you have built a static site and queried backend APIs. And type in an additional comment if you've not only done that, but had to do with multiple APIs from the same static site. I am assuming the number of you responding to this is going to be very high. And the reason why is because, like, you know, let's say you're building a simple website today, okay? Like a super, super simple website. So you have some like static front end and you have some API backends that you're hitting. How many times is it that you have to hit multiple API backends from your front end? I would say it's almost 100% of the time. I can't really think of the last time I built a static site, for example, that like I was only hitting a single backend. It's usually either, even if it's like something I'm controlling, there's probably like multiple backends that I'm hitting to like get different pieces of data, or maybe I have it split up based on domains or whatever. Or I'm just working with different providers. Like maybe I'm using some like web RTC provider to like do some video stuff, and I'm using some chat provider to do some chat stuff, and I'm using some like data provider like Firebase or whatever to do some data stuff on the back end. Whatever it is, I'm hitting all these different things. And there's a lot of like problems that come up because of that, right? Like you have to have different libraries to manage the authentication between all these services in your app, right? Then you have tokens for these services to like manage your session state or whatever you want to call it. And you have to learn how to use all these different things. So yes, GraphQL is incredibly useful in these environments in particular, because if you can just query these endpoints using a single thing, you can eradicate like a lot of the work that goes into just modern web development in general. So I absolutely agree. It's super useful there. And I wish more people would do it, honestly, because that would make my life a lot easier.
and a bit of a shameless plug in StepZen, we want to make it really, really easy. Right. And we've got some phenomenal people, some of the people that I talked about at the beginning, people who have joined us from varied backgrounds who are basically helping us kind of do the right tooling and others in those various environments. So that's absolutely awesome. I want to turn to, which is beyond this kind of general developer stuff where you are a guru anyway. If I didn't embarrass you enough, I'm going to make you the super guru of security. And I think that what happens is this, that security is quite often an afterthought as people are kind of building stuff, right? And it's an afterthought for many reasons. One is let me first build something to see whether I like it, right? And then I'll secure it. Because if I start thinking about security, then I'm caught up in kind of wrong sets of issues as opposed to this. That's one. The second is, of course, the world of security hasn't made it as easy as the world of kind of pure development has, right? So for both of those reasons, I think security becomes kind of the next thing that I worry about, as opposed to the first thing that I worry about, which is fine. But it also then leads to what I believe is going to be kind of significant sets of headlines over the course of next few years, where APIs and websites and others will get kind of compromised, okay, because of these things have been made really, really hard. So, Randall, I mean, first of all, do you agree with me? And second is, if so, what is the world of security really doing to make security accessible to the developers so they actually build stuff that is secure as soon as they build?
I will answer your question, but there's a third thing,
Yes.
which is the reason why people don't care about security that much. And it's just because it's straight up boring. It's a lot more boring than doing the other stuff. Like, it's a lot more fun to add a feature to your product for sure than to like learn some OAuth flows or like how to manage a token or how long a token should last or what. Like, that's just straight up boring, you know? I'm in this industry and it's what I work on every day, and I've been doing it for a really long time, and like, I find it boring. So if I find it boring, then, you know, it's definitely boring.
Yes.
Okay, so back to the question though. What are things that the security industry is doing to like make this easier, basically? Because, you know, one of the interesting things about security is like, yeah, you don't have to do it. Like, there's lots of ways to avoid doing security. But if you want to do it, it's hard. And it's hard for a few different reasons. You know, I think the first reason, just in general, security stuff is hard is because it's not like a one size fits all security solution. You know, you have to think of it in layers. Like, when you're writing an application that's talking to a database, you have to sanitize user inputs to the database. Otherwise, you end up with like SQL injection vulnerabilities or whatever.
Of course. Select, start, delete from table. Absolutely.
Right. Then when you're designing a static site, you have to worry about what sort of JavaScript code is being executed on your site. You have to worry about cross-site scripting attacks and setting up the CORS headers properly and all these different things. Then you have just all these different layers, right? So how do I think people are working to make it easier? Well, the part of the industry I'm really embedded in currently is really focused around like authentication and authorization, like getting people to log into stuff, log out of stuff securely. Sounds like a simple problem. It's quite complicated though. And the big trend I see in our space right now is that today, all the chatter in the industry is focused around these protocols, OAuth and OpenID Connect, and how do we get developers to learn more about them so they can do a better job of building things, which I think is the wrong approach. The right approach is for all of us to be building developer libraries and tools that abstract those concepts from developers so that you don't even need to know anything about it. And there's great ways to do that. That's one of the biggest things going on in the industry today is like people designing better developer libraries that handle these underlying issues behind the scenes. Because the reality of it, no matter how good or bad you think this is, but the reality is that security is always going to be really difficult because there's tons of ways to attack systems, and it is what it is. Like web development's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts. There's always going to be vulnerabilities. And so a lot of the protocol level stuff where we're trying to educate people, it's good to give people an understanding of things, but to expect them to understand all these intricate details and do a great job with it is just not practical. So I see a lot more emphasis, like Okta in particular, we're investing a ton of money and energy and engineering resources in just building better developer libraries and tools so that people don't need to know things. And I think that's where I see the industry going in the future as well, is like, what are things we can build so that you as a developer don't need to know anything about these things?
Yes, exactly. And then, of course, if you're curious enough, then you can go in and understand. But that steep part of learning curve is not a prereq for doing it. And so I had my own epiphany here about 5 years back, and kind of just bringing a bit of it into steps in. So as you know, some of us, Helen and Sridhar and a few others were at Apogee. And in Apogee, what we saw was that, yes, we kind of were able to provide API management and be able to kind of enable people to protect the APIs. But what we saw was there was always a tussle between the people who wanted APIs to be free and available to everyone, because for the product manager, it was really, really important for lots of people to kind of build your stuff. And then on the other hand were the people in the boiler room who were just saying, no, you can't do that, etc. The fundamental problem turned out to be kind of an organizational problem between the desire to make things easy versus the desire to kind of protect ourselves. And then as we kind of moved to steps in, and we started to say, look, let's kind of help people build out their APIs that power their Jamstack experiences and others, we realized that there is another manifestation of this problem. And the manifestation of this problem really is that in reality now browser is what's holding kind of the application logic. Okay, so you've kind of shifted the code to the browser, and all the if then else's and other things, etc., happen there. And obviously you can push some of it down into the API tier as you're doing with section. But there's still a fundamental problem that if there's nothing between the browser and the backend, okay, how do you kind of ensure that the call that's coming in has not been manipulated in some way, okay, in order to actually change, right? So how do you kind of still get the benefits of being completely static and browser centric, and yet make sure that when API calls are made and all that stuff, that bad things are not happening? And again, really, it's a matter of not saying, oh my God, worry about X, Y, Z, and A and B, but what tooling can we do? How can we make it really easy as you set up your APIs for them to be protected by default, protected by domain, for them to be open or closed, depending on some simple flag settings and everything else. And I think there's a lot of work to be done, and we at StepZen are trying to take some interesting and important steps there.
Yeah, I mean, it's an extremely difficult problem. I spent a lot of time working on this. So let's talk about the example you proposed. You're building a static site, and you have an API backend that your static site is going to make requests to do things. Okay. In the simplest case, if you have an API backend that is like, or let's say your website is designed to be totally public, something that doesn't require any sort of user login whatsoever. So in that case, is there any safe way for you to protect your APIs so that only your front end, browser-based client can talk to them? Well, let's think about it for a moment. How would you normally protect an API? Well, you'd have some API keys, maybe like a public and a private, like an ID and a secret, let's say. And you would embed those IDs and secrets into your application code so that every time your application makes a request to your API, it'll just send those in an HTTP header to your API service to say like, yes, these credentials are valid. In a static site world, that doesn't work because you can't embed, for example, an ID and a secret inside of a JavaScript, app, because someone will right-click, view source, find your API key and secret, your ID and secret, and just misuse it, right? So you got to take that option off the table. So outside of that, if you can't securely store something in JavaScript, how do you securely communicate in that scenario where there's no user involved? And the answer is you just don't. There is no way. So if you have a static site, first of all, that has no user context, no one's logging into it, there is nothing you can do to protect APIs. The best you can do is what is basically like infrastructure things. Like, for example, you can say, hey, we're going to fingerprint this browser and we're going to allow a certain rate limit of requests to be made from this device, let's say. And yes, there's ways for people to abuse that. You can also, rate limit based on IP address or whatever, but that's like a very rudimentary way to have some level of control over it. But now let's talk about the real use case, which is where you do have some user. Because most sites, if they're public facing, like you might have to do some stuff, but security is not a big concern, right? Like, who cares? Like, it's public. That's the whole idea of it. So security really only comes into play when you start thinking about users. So let's say you have this public site, but there's also a private component to it. So you have the static site, it's built in React or whatever, and someone's on the front page doing things, that's fine, but then they log in and go to a dashboard. Well, let's talk about this now. How do we protect the API now? Because we have a user who's authenticated somehow, and now they need to securely communicate from the browser to the backend API so that no other users can grab their sensitive data, right? So how do you do that? Well, the way you do that is using OAuth and OpenID Connect. Actually, if you're not familiar with OAuth and OpenID Connect, by the way, I'm going to save you some time. OAuth is like a specification that talks about how do you communicate with different things. And OpenID Connect is like a tiny extension on top of OAuth that just provides some extra features, but they're the same underlying thing. So if I use the term OAuth or OpenID Connect, just know that I'm basically saying OpenID Connect, but they're basically the same thing. So with that being said, what happens is when the user goes to log in, they're going to send their credentials to your backend service somewhere to say, I would like to authenticate, please. And the service, what it's going to do is it's going to say, okay, I'm going to check your email. I'm going to check your password. I'm going to make sure these are correct. Then I'm going to generate a temporary token for you. And this is like your session. So that token ends up in the browser, and the browser can then store it somewhere safe. Now, there's lots of different ways to store it. You can store it in like local storage, session storage, IndexedDB, web workers, whatever. We're not going to talk about that. But you basically have this authentication token that is on the browser somewhere. So once the users, or now that they've logged in, they have this token in the browser. Every time the user makes a request to do something on your site from the static site, and that generates a request from the browser to the backend API, your browser is going to pull that token out of wherever it's stored and attach it to the HTTP authorization header so that the backend service can then parse this token out, see who the user is, and then say like, yes, this user is allowed to access this data, or, yes, this user is allowed to do this thing or that thing. So you really have to rely on this like underlying protocol stuff to make that happen, basically. And that's the main way to do it today, really. Since you can't have like a secure session cookie or anything like that that's automatic, it requires a little more developer activity because you have to know where this token is. You have to know how to use it and how to send it to your backend. But doing it that way is going to be the best way to lock things down, so to speak.
Yes, and within this context, that's an awesome primer on some of the things that we can and should do. But there are also some other very, very interesting bits that happen. So, for example, you are setting up an endpoint that, for example, displays, or that, for example, can list out the set of products that are available for sale by month. Okay, and you're doing a static site generator where that month is set to be the next month, and that's great, fantastic. The person is authenticated and everything else, but if that person is malicious or tries something, he or she can change that month to the next month and find out products that are available for sale in Christmas, and that could be competitive information, right? And so the question really becomes is that there is a whole kind of slew of things that you've got to do, which is not just about is the person who the person is the person authorized to ask what the person is authorized to ask, but have the parameters been changed and configured and everything else. And as you rightfully pointed out, there's no one solution to all of it, but we in StepZen are kind of putting together a set of Lego piece parts that will allow developers to kind of very quickly assemble these kind of sets of requirements from completely free to completely locked down based on kind of the needs, and just make sure that the cognitive overload is as low as can be.
Yeah, it's the stuff you're describing is extremely difficult, right? Because in general, there's no one size fits all standard or whatever, you know? Like when you're talking about you have a static site and you maybe your backend API accepts a parameterized request that says like, yeah, I want to see all the items on sale this month or next month, right? And you're like, yeah, well, if anyone can just tweak this URI and put in, December or whatever, they can see our Christmas sales like 6 months before they happen. That's bad. And you're right. There has to be really good logic. And that's one of the reasons why security is so damn hard, right? Is like, there's always different things. For those of you watching this, by the way, I'm also going to do a shameless plug right now. But if you haven't played around with StepZen, the company that Anant runs, they do honestly really cool stuff. Like basically StepZen, what it does is it allows you to like have a single GraphQL interface to talk to whatever backing services you want, whether it's like a private API like you've built, whether it's like public API services or whatever. And it handles a lot of these situations we're talking about. Like StepZen has some really cool stuff they've been working on where you can manage like complex policies, like who's allowed to do what in different scenarios. Like it's an extremely useful, cool tool that you should all check out if you haven't seen it.
Awesome, and thank you very much. That was not not expected, but since he has embarrassed me, I'm going to kind of end this podcast by embarrassing him once again. So one of the things that I read about you, Randall, was that you quote unquote tried to get your computer science degree, but you said that you were a terrible student.
Oh, okay? Definitely a terrible student.
Right, but I don't actually believe it because everything that I've interacted with you, I think that you're just an awesome student. So there's something that makes for kind of the curious mind and kind of a phenomenal developer that is not the same as being kind of rote computer science learning. There's something about it, okay, that if you can just kind of tell our listeners and readers about what are one or two things that you think made you who you are, without kind of praising yourself, without saying, look, I'm such a great dude and everything else. You can say that too, right? What are one or two things that you think make for kind of continuous learning, even if you are a self-professed bad student?
Yeah, I mean, I am not
going to
embarrass
you enough.
Yeah, look, I'm not going to pretend I know everything. I will share my personal experience though, and one other thing. Like, personally, I was a terrible student because I'm interested in a very small subset of things. Like for me, I went to university and started working my computer science degree, and I did my computer science courses, and I got extremely good grades in those. I liked them a lot. But I flunked out of my general ed requirements, like taking world of music and music history and stuff. Like I could not force myself to do it for the life of me. And that's what I meant when I say I'm a terrible student. Like I just don't have the the willpower, I will say, to stick with stuff that is like, not, I guess, super aligned with me. So the thing that I think is really important is I read this article years ago. I actually just pulled it up again. I read it like every now and again. It's called "There's No Speed Limit," and it's written by Derek Sivers, who's like an amazing tech person. And I'm going to do a terrible job butchering this, but here it goes. The concept that Derek talks about in this article, it's really short, is he's basically talking about like when he was learning music growing up, and he paid this like world-class musician to teach him like how to play music, I guess, or whatever it was. And the musician basically told him like, hey, I will teach you this stuff. Show up at my house. But here's the thing. Normally, if you want to learn, like, let's say how to play piano or whatever, you're going to go through piano classes for like 10 years. And you're going to practice and practice and practice and do all these things. And the point of the article is you don't have to take 10 years to do something, right? Like, let's say you're in school. You could take 4 years to finish your university degree. You could take the normal amount of classes. You could do all these things. Or you can just learn it all really quick, as fast as you want. There is no speed limit in the real world, And when I sort of thought about that concept, it really changed a lot of my life, honestly, because I thought, wait a sec, I don't need to like necessarily conform to the way everyone else is doing things. If I'm really interested in learning how to build this thing, I can just go build it. I'll figure things out on the way. Or, hey, if I'm really interested in learning Go programming, I'm going to get a book on Go programming. I'm going to read it in like 2 days, and I'm going to build like 50 different things and learn Go programming really well. I'm not going to like, enroll in some course and spend 3 years like, watching YouTube videos on it or whatever. There's a certain amount of stuff you can learn right away, and there's a certain amount of stuff that takes time. But I guess the point is like, if you're interested in something, you should just do it all the way, and don't listen to what other people say when they tell you, yeah, you have to do it this way, you have to do it that way. You should just do it your way, the way that you find the most beneficial. And that's what has really worked for me, is just finding things I care about and just committing to them 100%.
Well, that's awesome and really, really inspiring. So we've had a phenomenal conversation. We started off with what started you off as a developer, and we kind of ended on kind of the learning world, and we went through a lot of other aspects, perspectives, what's really happening with tooling, what's happening in the world of Jamstack, what's happening in the world of GraphQL, how do you actually connect, how do you do security together, and everything else. And I'm reminded of a T.S. Eliot quote, because we kind of ended up in the same place as to what makes a developer tick. But this is a very favorite T.S. Eliot quote of mine. We shall not cease from exploration, and at the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. So we that's the kind of journey that I strive for all the time, and that's kind of the mini world that we try to create in this podcast. Oh, sorry, in this cast. So hopefully all of you had a great time. I learned a lot, and thank you very much, Sam.
Hey, thanks for having me. It's always a pleasure talking to you, and thanks to everyone who's watching this live, like Anthony, Lucia, Remote Synth, Fred, everyone else on there, all of you lurking in the shadows. Like, thanks for tuning in. It's really cool to interact with people and just talk about fun stuff. So it was a pleasure.
Awesome, thank you. Hey, Brian, what do we do now?